For centuries, we've been told that Europe fell into darkness after Rome collapsed. But what if that story wasn't written by medieval people, but about them? Tonight, we return to the sources. The people who lived through the Middle Ages never called their world dark. This perception emerged later, in the 14th century, with the Italian scholar Petrarch. In his work Africa, he lamented what he saw as a cultural decay following the fall of Rome. Petrarch and his fellow humanists framed their own era as a Rinascita, or rebirth of classical brilliance. To do this, they needed a contrasting period of stagnation, an age of darkness. The narrative they constructed was not a reflection of medieval reality, but a rhetorical tool to elevate their own historical moment. The very idea of a dark age was invented to make the Renaissance appear brighter. The myth often begins with the claim that literacy vanished, and with it, the great books of antiquity. However, the evidence from monasteries across Europe tells a different story. In scriptoria from Ireland to Italy, monks meticulously copied manuscripts by hand. The Codex Amiatinus, an enormous complete Bible produced at the Wearmouth Jarrow Monastery in England around 700 AD, demonstrates the immense resources and skill dedicated to this work. These monastic libraries did not only preserve Christian texts. They were archives for Roman authors like Virgil and Cicero, Greek philosophers, and scientific treatises, ensuring their survival through the centuries. Books never vanished. They were curated and protected. Another persistent myth is that higher education disappeared until the Renaissance. Yet, the university itself is a uniquely medieval invention. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, is recognized as the oldest in the world, followed by Paris and Oxford in the 12th century. These institutions were not informal gatherings but structured centers of learning with formal curricula, degrees, and rigorous academic debate known as scholastic disputation. The records of these universities reveal a world committed to intellectual inquiry, where logic and reason were paramount. Higher education is not a Renaissance innovation. Its foundations were laid in the High Middle Ages. The period is often portrayed as a time of superstition, hostile to scientific inquiry. This view overlooks the work of scholars who championed empirical methods long before the scientific revolution. The 13th century Franciscan friar Roger Bacon, in his Opus Majus, argued that without experience, nothing can be sufficiently known. He wrote extensively on optics, astronomy, and alchemy, emphasizing the necessity of observation and experimentation. Bacon was not an isolated figure but part of a broader intellectual tradition that sought to understand the natural world through systematic investigation. They experimented, they observed, and they recorded. A central element of the Dark Ages narrative is that Roman knowledge was irrevocably lost. The reality is that it was archived, not erased. Roman law, in particular, was meticulously preserved and expanded upon. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation for legal systems across medieval Europe. Similarly, Roman engineering principles, though adapted, never disappeared, as seen in the construction of fortifications and bridges. The philosophical works of antiquity were also transmitted, often through translations from Arabic, keeping the classical tradition alive for later scholars. The idea that technological progress halted after Rome's fall is contradicted by the agricultural landscape of medieval Europe. Progress didn't stop, it shifted. The invention and widespread adoption of the heavy plow in the early Middle Ages allowed farmers to cultivate the dense, fertile soils of northern Europe, which had been unworkable with the lighter Roman ard. This innovation, combined with the horse collar that enabled horses to pull heavier loads without choking, and the proliferation of windmills and watermills for grinding grain, dramatically increased agricultural productivity and supported a growing population. Contrary to the image of abandoned cities and a return to purely agrarian life, urban centers experienced significant growth from the 10th century onward. Urban life didn't collapse. It transformed and expanded. Archaeological evidence from cities like London, Paris, and Florence shows the rapid development of new market squares, guild halls, and residential districts. These towns became bustling hubs of commerce, craftsmanship, and social organization, connected by extensive trade networks. This urban revival demonstrates a dynamic and increasingly complex society. The narrative of an isolated insular Europe also fails under scrutiny. Global trade never ended. Medieval merchants from Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa established extensive trade routes connecting Europe to the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and even Asia. The chronicles of travelers like Marco Polo describe a world linked by the exchange of goods, from spices and silks to raw materials. These networks facilitated not just economic activity, but also the cross-pollination of ideas, technologies, and cultures. Europe was a participant in a connected world. Medical practice is frequently depicted as a realm of crude superstition. However, the Middle Ages saw the establishment of the first organized hospitals. These institutions, often founded by monastic orders or city governments, provided care for the sick and infirm, moving beyond simple charity to a more systematic approach to treatment. Medical texts from the School of Salerno in Italy, a leading center for medicine from the 11th century, show a blend of inherited classical knowledge with new observations and practices. Hospitals are medieval, not a modern invention. The contributions of women are often erased in accounts of this period, creating a false impression of universal silence. In reality, women wrote, ruled, and taught. The 12th century German abbess Hildegard of Bingen is a prime example. She was a polymath who produced major works of theology, composed music, and wrote scientific and medical texts like Physica and Causa et Curae, which are still studied today. Her extensive correspondence with popes and emperors shows a woman of immense intellectual and political influence. To claim women were silenced is to ignore the powerful voices that the sources preserve. The stereotype of a world without a precise sense of time is disproven by one of the period's most significant technological achievements, the mechanical clock. Developed in Europe in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, these devices, initially installed in clock towers, fundamentally reshaped society. They allowed for the standardization of work hours, the scheduling of civil life, and a new conception of time as a measurable, linear entity. Clocks changed the world long before the Renaissance. The architectural achievements of the Middle Ages stand as a powerful refutation of cultural decline. Stone tells the story. The great Gothic cathedrals, such as Chartres and Notre Dame, were feats of engineering that pushed the limits of what was thought possible. Their soaring vaults, flying buttresses, and vast stained glass windows required advanced knowledge of mathematics, geometry, and structural mechanics. These projects demanded complex, long-term planning and the coordinated labor of thousands of skilled artisans, a testament to a highly organized and ambitious society. The notion of a lawless, chaotic society is inconsistent with the legal developments of the period. Justice was codified. Beginning in the 11th century, scholars like Gratian systematically compiled and rationalized centuries of canon law, creating a coherent legal framework for the Church. Simultaneously, the study of Roman civil law was revived, leading to the development of sophisticated legal systems that influenced secular governance across Europe. This process formalized legal reasoning and established procedures for courts and trials. Medieval philosophy, often dismissed as sterile and dogmatic, was in fact exceptionally rigorous. They debated everything. The scholastic method, which dominated university education, placed a premium on logic, evidence, and argumentation. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica constructed vast intellectual systems by posing questions, presenting opposing arguments, and then resolving contradictions through logical analysis. This method trained generations of scholars in precise and structured thinking. Art during this period is sometimes judged by Renaissance standards of realism and found wanting. This is to misunderstand its purpose. Art didn't disappear, it changed. The symbolic logic of medieval art valued spiritual truth over photographic accuracy. The intricate illuminations in manuscripts like the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels were not failed attempts at realism but complex theological statements rendered in pattern and color. The style was different, but it was not a sign of decline. The mathematical toolkit available to Europeans expanded significantly during the Middle Ages. Numbers moved forward. The introduction of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero, was popularized in Europe by figures like Leonardo of Pisa, also known as Fibonacci, in his 1202 book, Liber Abaci. This system was vastly more efficient for arithmetic and algebra than Roman numerals, revolutionizing commerce, accounting, and the nascent sciences. The period also saw the birth of modern European languages. National languages were born in written form. While Latin remained the language of the church and scholarship, authors began writing in the vernacular. Works like Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in English, and the Chanson de Roland in French helped to standardize these languages and create distinct national literary traditions. The very history of the Middle Ages was recorded by its own people. They documented themselves. From the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to the detailed accounts of court life by chroniclers like Jane Froissart, medieval writers left behind a rich and continuous historical record. These works carefully recorded political events, social changes, and cultural life year by year, providing the raw data that allows modern historians to reconstruct the period. When examined closely, the label Dark Ages collapses under the weight of evidence. Archaeology, in particular, consistently uncovers a world of sophisticated material culture, complex trade networks, and dynamic settlement patterns that contradict the notion of widespread stagnation or collapse. The evidence on the ground simply does not support the literary trope of 1,000 years of darkness. Ultimately, the myth of the Dark Ages served a clear purpose. By portraying the millennium between Rome and their own time as an age of ignorance and decline, Renaissance humanists and later Enlightenment thinkers could position themselves as the restorers of reason and civilization. The Dark Ages made others look brighter. The term is not a historical descriptor, but a judgment one that reveals more about the ambitions of those who coined it than about the era it purports to describe. The Middle Ages weren't perfect, but they weren't dark. They were complex, creative, and misunderstood, and history deserves better labels. Thanks a ton for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Your support means the world and helps us create more awesome content.